The county courthouse was buzzing with quiet chatter as people settled into their seats. It was just another trial day for most, but for Angela Morris it was everything. She sat calmly at the defendant's table, her posture straight, her eyes steady. A middle-aged black woman, she wore no lawyer's suit, no polished attorney's badge. Instead, she wore dignity, choosing to represent herself in a courtroom where few believed she could win. Across the room stood Prosecutor James Whitfield, a man whose arrogance was as well known as his expensive suits. He had built his reputation on intimidation, cornering defendants with slick rhetoric and smug confidence. When he learned Angela intended to defend herself, he smirked. To him, it wasn't bravery. It was foolishness. As the judge entered and the room quieted, Whitfield rose for his opening remarks. His voice dripped with condescension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you'll hear a case that should have been resolved quickly. The defendant, Mrs. Morris, has chosen to forgo legal counsel. Now, while I admire her courage," he paused mockingly, "we must remember that the law is complex. It's not a place for amateur theatrics. I expect she'll struggle to understand the very basics." Snickers rippled through a few spectators. Angela's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on him, letting the prosecutor dig his own grave with arrogance. Whitfield strutted across the floor, holding up papers as if they were indisputable truth. "This case is straightforward. The defendant violated the law. She stands here trying to excuse herself with emotional pleas. But emotion doesn't change facts. And facts, ladies and gentlemen, are on my side." He glanced at Angela, giving her a smirk that carried more insult than words. "I'll do my best to keep things simple enough for the defendant to follow along." The judge raised an eyebrow at his tone but said nothing. Angela finally stood when given her turn. She moved with deliberate calm, her voice clear and steady. "Good morning, Your Honor, members of the jury. I may not have a degree in law, but I do have truth. And truth doesn't require a license to be spoken." Her words carried a quiet weight that silenced the laughter. People leaned forward, suddenly curious. She continued, "The prosecutor wants you to believe this case is simple. And it is, but not in the way he claims. You will see that his facts are assumptions, and his evidence has holes wide enough to step through." Whitfield shifted slightly, the first flicker of irritation crossing his face. He hadn't expected her to sound so composed. Angela looked directly at the jury. "I stand here not just for myself, but for everyone who has been told they are too uneducated, too unworthy, or too powerless to speak up. By the end of this trial, you will see that dignity and determination are stronger than arrogance." The room was still. The battle lines were drawn, and though the prosecutor thought he had already won, Angela had just planted the first seeds of doubt. The trial moved into its next phase, and Whitfield wasted no time presenting what he called ironclad evidence. He strutted before the jury, dropping exhibits onto the table with dramatic flair. "Ladies and gentlemen, Exhibit A clearly shows the defendant's involvement. There's no mistaking it." Angela quietly examined the document once it was handed to her. She adjusted her glasses, scanning each line carefully before rising. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful yet firm, "I'd like the jury to take a closer look at this so-called proof. Notice the date in the top right corner." She held it up for all to see. "This report is dated weeks before the incident in question. It cannot possibly serve as evidence of my guilt." A murmur swept across the courtroom. Whitfield stiffened, quickly flipping through his notes, his confident smile faltering. That's just a clerical oversight," he stammered. Angela didn't press the point aggressively. Instead, she allowed the jury to absorb the discrepancy themselves. Then, with composed precision, she moved on. "Now, regarding Exhibit B," she continued, pointing to a photograph the prosecutor had waved earlier. "The prosecution claims this photo places me at the scene. But if you look closely, the person pictured has a tattoo on their wrist." Angela rolled up her sleeve, showing her bare arm. "I have no such mark. This is not me." The jury leaned in, visibly surprised. Even the judge peered closer, his expression unreadable. Whitfield's frustration grew. "It's a grainy image, could be anyone," he muttered, but the confidence in his voice was gone. Angela returned to her seat for a moment, then stood again, her calm demeanor commanding attention. "The prosecution has presented shaky evidence and called it truth. But truth requires more than assumptions. It requires accuracy, honesty, and respect for this court, none of which we have seen from Mr. Whitfield today." The prosecutor's face flushed. He attempted to redirect, calling a witness to the stand. But Angela was prepared. She cross-examined each one with precision, her questions sharp yet respectful. "You claim you saw me there," she asked one witness. "But wasn't it dark? Didn't you admit earlier you only caught a glimpse from across the street?" The witness hesitated, fumbling. "Well, yes, but—" Angela leaned slightly forward, her voice steady. "So what you saw was uncertain. You cannot swear under oath it was me." The silence that followed was heavy. Piece by piece, she chipped away at the prosecution's case, not with theatrics, but with facts delivered in simple, undeniable logic. By the time she finished her cross-examination, the jurors were no longer leaning toward Whitfield's showmanship. They were leaning toward her quiet confidence. She had not only defended herself, she had exposed the prosecutor's arrogance as weakness. Whitfield sat down, his face tight with frustration. For the first time in his career, he felt the trial slipping out of his control. By the second day of the trial, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The gallery had grown larger, with curious townsfolk gathering to witness the spectacle. Many had come expecting to see Angela falter under pressure, but instead, they were watching her transform the case into something far greater than anyone imagined. Prosecutor Whitfield, once smug and commanding, now carried a forced grin, trying to mask his frustration. His every attempt to regain dominance ended with Angela calmly dismantling his claims. He relied on intimidation and showmanship. She relied on clarity and truth. And the contrast was striking. At one point, Whitfield presented what he called his strongest evidence. A witness who claimed Angela had confessed outside the courthouse weeks prior. The witness, a man with a shaky reputation, took the stand and repeated his story with dramatic flair. "She told me herself," he insisted, looking to Whitfield for approval. Angela rose slowly, walking to the witness stand with measured steps. Her tone was polite but unyielding. "Sir, you say I confessed to you? At what time and place did this supposed conversation occur?" The man fumbled, shifting in his seat. It was late, outside the courthouse. Can't recall the exact day." Angela tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp. "You can't recall the date? Or the time? Yet you remember my exact words." The man swallowed hard, sweat forming at his brow. "Well, maybe not exact, but close enough." She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the human memory doesn't work selectively. If someone heard a shocking confession, they would remember when and where it happened. If they can't recall those simple details, then the confession is nothing more than imagination." The witness stammered, looking helplessly at Whitfield, who avoided his gaze. The jury, meanwhile, nodded almost in unison, impressed with Angela's calm but devastating logic. As the trial went on, Angela's poise never wavered. She took notes diligently, objected at the right moments, and spoke with a clarity that lawyers with years of training sometimes struggled to match. It was becoming evident that she had spent countless hours preparing. When the judge called for a recess, whispers filled the room. Spectators marveled at her composure. "She's outsmarting him," one woman whispered to her neighbor. "I've never seen anything like it." Whitfield sat at his desk, seething. For years, his career had thrived on belittling those without power, crushing them under the weight of his confidence. But this woman, this self-represented defendant, was unraveling him piece by piece. By the time the recess ended, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. No longer was this the trial of an unprepared defendant. It was the trial of a prosecutor's pride. And pride was losing. Angela returned to her seat, her face calm but her spirit fierce. For the first time, everyone in the courtroom could see what Whitfield refused to admit. The balance of power had changed. The final day of the trial arrived with an electric tension in the courtroom. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and even people who normally had no interest in legal proceedings came to witness what many were calling the showdown. On one side sat Prosecutor James Whitfield, his once confident demeanor now replaced by forced composure. On the other sat Angela Morris, steady and unshaken, as if she had carried the weight of this battle her whole life. Whitfield delivered his closing argument with all the dramatic energy he could muster. He paced back and forth, gesturing at the jury, raising his voice at just the right moments. "Don't be swayed by theatrics," he warned them, ironically blind to his own performance. "The defendant is no lawyer. She cannot bend the law to her will. The evidence proves her guilt beyond doubt." But the words rang hollow. The jury had seen his evidence crumble piece by piece under Angela's questioning. They had watched his witnesses falter and contradict themselves. And they had seen Angela, without legal training, reveal holes in his case that even seasoned attorneys might have missed. Then it was her turn. Angela stood slowly, her presence commanding without force. She walked to the center of the courtroom and looked at the jury, not with arrogance, but with honesty. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "You've heard the prosecutor mock me for not having a degree, for daring to speak for myself. But truth does not belong to lawyers alone. It belongs to anyone brave enough to stand by it." She held up the faulty report he had introduced earlier. "He called this evidence. You saw the date weeks before the incident. That is not evidence. That is carelessness." She lifted the photograph. "He said this was me. Yet the person in this picture has a tattoo I do not have. That is not proof. That is assumption." She let the papers fall back onto the table with a soft thud, her eyes never leaving the jury. "You have seen his case unravel. Not because I am clever, but because the truth cannot be twisted into something it is not. I ask you to judge not by his arrogance, not by his titles, but by the facts. And the facts are clear. I am not guilty." The courtroom was silent when she returned to her seat. Even Whitfield, who usually had a snide remark ready, said nothing. Hours later, the jury filed back into the room. The foreman rose, cleared his throat, and announced the verdict, "Not guilty." A wave of relief swept over Angela. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, whispering a silent prayer of thanks. Around her, whispers of admiration spread through the gallery. Some even clapped quietly before the judge restored order. Whitfield, red-faced and humiliated, avoided everyone's gaze. His arrogance had been shattered in public, his reputation scarred not by a rival lawyer, but by the very woman he mocked. As Angela left the courtroom, people approached her, shaking her hand, some even in tears. "You stood up not just for yourself," one woman said, "but for all of us who've ever been told we weren't enough." Angela smiled softly. "The law belongs to the people, and justice will always belong to the truth."